Um, Greetings, everyone. I'm happy to welcome all of our guests and viewers. This is the first Cambridge Ukrainian Studies conversation of the 2021-22 academic year. And I am Andrei Smitsnyuk, language teaching officer in Ukrainian at the Faculty of Modern Medieval Languages and Linguistics here at the University of Cambridge. And we here at Cambridge Ukrainian Studies are opening this academic year with a special event today, bringing together in conversation Dr. Tymofiy Mylovanov and Dr. Andrei Kirilenko to talk about previous government reforms in Ukraine, current state of economic affairs, and upcoming challenges that the country might face. And now, please let me briefly introduce our guest speakers. First of all, Dr. Tymofiy Mylovanov, thank you for coming here. Dr. Mylovanov is a former Minister of Economic Development, Trade and Agriculture of Ukraine in the government of Oleksiy Goncharuk, who we had for an interview last year. And currently, Dr. Mylovanov holds the title of the President of Kyiv School of Economics and the title of the Associate Professor at the University of Pittsburgh in the United States, where he teaches microeconomics. And Forbes Ukraine included Dr. Mylovanov in the list of the top economic thinkers from Ukraine. Dr. Andrei Kirilenko is Professor of Finance, Director of the Doctoral program, and also the founding director of the Center for Finance, Technology and Regulation at the Cambridge Judge Business School. And previously, Dr. Kirilenko was the founding director of the Center for Global Finance and Technology at the Imperial College Business School. Prior to that, he was a professor of the practice of finance at MIT and co-director of the MIT Center for Finance and Policy. This conversation will take the form of a 1 hour long, approximately 1 hour long interview in which Dr. Kirilenko will interview Dr. Mylovanov. And the interview will be followed by a 30 minutes long Q&A session. And I would like to ask our viewers to submit your questions in written form through Q&A feature on Zoom at any moment during or after the interview. And I now give the floor to our honored guests, and I'm sure that our viewers will join me in welcoming them to our webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for organizing it, Pan Andrew, and thank you. We're very, very pleased to contribute to this effort. It's great to be able to speak about Ukraine, to discuss sort of current, past, and forthcoming economic challenges of Ukraine. I think this should contribute, give a lot of flavor to people who may read about Ukraine or have some understanding of Ukraine or maybe come from Ukraine. But today we'll have a very, very unique opportunity to actually speak with someone who is classically Western trained PhD economist who's published in top economic journals, who has since the tragic events of that happened in Ukraine has decided to apply his talents towards really building institutions and building economic policies in Ukraine to make it, a modern, successful, well-developed state. So he has a lot of talents. He's proven to his academic colleagues how good he is, and he's applied himself in a number of ways. He's worked as part of the board, deputy chairman of the National Bank of Ukraine board that oversees the work of the National Bank of Ukraine. He has worked as you said, Pan Andrei, as a minister of the economy with other things added to it. He has built or rebuilt rather the Kyiv School of Economics into a sort of a powerhouse that it's becoming today, from it was nearly failing. It was at a state of near complete failure, and he's taken it over and made it into an educational institution that will supply, a stream of talent into a variety of businesses and government offices. He is working as an advisor to the Office of the President. He's a chairman of the holding of Ukrainian sort of state defense holding of companies. So he has he's applying his talents to where they're really, really needed. And we have the unique opportunity to sort of ask him, what's it like? And he's not like someone who just sort of randomly happened to be there. I mean, to me, and of course it's for him to answer that, these are deliberate steps that he has taken to make, to add to places, or to make contribution to where he sees contributions are needed. And I'd like to ask by asking perhaps Timofey, so what's it like being inside the sausage factory? How are these decisions being made? Are you learning? What are you seeing from the inside? Because you're very well trained, you know how it's supposed to be, and you have the tools and methods and frameworks, but now you're doing it with your own hands. What's it like?
I'm thinking. It's nothing what it appears. Nothing what it appears. It's very driven by immediate pressures. It's democracy in Ukraine, so we're essentially on every area, in every direction, we are restricted by the overall culture and knowledge of the public. So if the public is not informed on an issue, then there is a vacuum which can be manipulated. And so you have populism. The public is informed about a specific topic, then it's much more difficult. I have found it's more useful to think, I have found that thinking in terms of institutions is not useful in Ukraine. I've also found that it's useful to think in terms of drama. Drama meaning, script writing. How you study, movies or, good stories. And it's also useful to think in terms of deep cultural assumptions that different groups of society hold about how the world operates. So we call it culture, but it's ingrained culture, it's deeper culture. And so the conflicts between these different elements of culture, they shape the political landscape, and through that they shape the economic policies. So I had to relearn a little bit. Institutions work, but in a deeper sense, it's groups of peoples. So these are not rules of the games, but these are cultural beliefs of people. And then you have different groups of people who protect those beliefs. And so if you want to change, you really have to bring different groups of people. But these cultural assumptions, they have to be functional. So now I'm going to become a little bit more concrete. A lot of effort has been expanded in Ukraine to fight corruption. Then we talk at this perspective from the institutional angle. If we look at the corruption from the institutional angle, we've done everything we should have done. We have with the help of the international community, using the best practices in the world, we have established an anti-corruption court. We have established a agency, which is an anti-corruption agency. We have a special prosecutor's office. We have a special investigative. We have an investigative bureau. Many of them are independent in true sense from top leadership of the country. They have resources. So everything has been done properly. And people would claim that there are successes, but fundamentally, you have not changed the culture of making decisions, people still get salaries, let's say in some of the state-owned companies, people are getting, a CEO would get a salary of $200 or $500 a month, operating, millions or hundreds of millions of dollars annually. And you wonder, how could that be happening? Are these people just heroes and volunteers? Of course, they are not, majority of them. So then we're not asking the question why that is not changing. I used to think while being outside, and even when being a minister, I used to think that one of the solutions is increase salaries to civil servants, for example, to bring them to the market value. But I understand that there is resistance, and I used to think that the resistance is coming from, let's say, top politicians who want to control the civil servants, but that's not the case now. I think it's just coming again from those deeply held cultural beliefs about what a civil servant should be paid by people who vote. So if the voters are people, if there's inequality in the population, that's a constraint on the ability to raise salaries publicly. So you have to sacrifice as accountability. So you have to pay privately, or you have to sacrifice salaries. But at the deeper level, you have to ask the question: how is the new generations of people who come into the government become corrupt? If we talk about corruption, and it is coming from the learning experience that people who are trying to be non-corrupt, they are not as effective in achieving their political, career, policy goals as people who are corrupt. And so when we are just building institutions which tend to just fight corruption, we end up prosecuting people. That's fine, but it really just keeps driving away talent from the civil service sector. We're not asking the question, what is the learning moment that a person who have not been, experiencing corruption learns that that's the way to do it? And how can we change that? Because culture is about learning successes and learning failures. So if people learn, as many of us have, that if you do everything right, you are not gonna get any result, or you have to have, you have to sacrifice a lot, have to pay a high price. So we need to learn what's really is happening, and we need, and corruption is about resource, and it's political competition, and people who are, who have more resource, they are more successful. And so it's in kind of, in terms of economics, it's an all-pay auction. Everyone has to pay. You do your budget constraint, you lose. So it becomes inevitable. So this is one example. Another example is when people who are Western trained, they come in, and they basically have very different beliefs about how about meritocracy, for instance, about the type of skills that are needed. And then they become arrogant and snobbish with respect to the incumbents, to the system. And so that polarizes, and they lose support, and they need support of those people. So they're not effective. And because they're not effective, they get frustrated and they quit. So to sum it up, I've learned that looking at things from the institutional perspective is not often productive. And sometimes if we take it in a very formal way, just copy paste the best practices without understanding the principles that led to those best practices, that can, backfire. That could be counterproductive. And on the other hand, trying to think about culture and these deeply held cultural assumptions about what works and what doesn't, and how people learn it, is what determines how the policy is being shaped. And overall, I think the role of the government is, because the government, so on the individual level, it's very frustrating. On the fundamental level, I think it's exciting, because the government is not very effective, and we are moving towards the environment in which the role of government is getting smaller and smaller, and it's focusing on the priorities such as national security, defense, education, pension, support or reforms, things which the government should be doing. The government doesn't have authority or doesn't have resources and capability to handle all other areas in which it was present. So, this post-Soviet Union culture is ineffective and it's dying out. So fundamentally, I think if we take a longer term perspective, Ukraine has made tremendous progress over the last 10, 15 years, both culturally and economically. And there are strong institutions in place, but they're at the lower level where there are professional bureaucrats, and some of them are well paid. So this is the, sort of things are changing on the longer cycle, on the longer time scale. But in the short run, if you look at, just try to think about culture rather than about institutions. So that's the major insight for me, I think.
Interesting. Let's stay on a couple of those things. One of them, it's a very interesting point you made, and as Andrei said, you are a professor who teaches game theory, and you've contributed to game theory, and sort of there are some game theoretic undertones, including learning, including information, including behavior when you talked about corruption. So you have, and about payoffs, right? So you can make negative payoffs higher, with a certain prosecuting authorities. You can make positive payoffs higher by paying higher salaries and compensating more, but something sort of is not working, not stabilizing there. So playing a sort of corrupt strategy still gets you to higher payoff overall than playing a non-corrupt strategy. What are you seeing there? What could be done there? Like are you seeing any particular way of changing that? What should be the game?
Oh, not for everyone. That's not the case that for everyone being corrupt is more profitable. And there are a lot of people who are non-corrupt. And I think, in fact, if you look at the ranks of people, the cadre, majority probably are not corrupt. But it is also true that it is quite an effective strategy, maybe not for personal enrichment. I think that has been achieved, that, people who become ridiculously corrupt, because of transparency and accountability, they get persecuted or they get out of politics really quickly. And, scandals are there, all kinds of, and sometimes rightly, sometimes there are a lot of false positives, but things are there, and that is overall, again, at the macro level, I think the amount of corruption is subsided substantively. It has to be measured in some ways, but you can look at the infrastructure, this projects on infrastructure, massive investments in infrastructure, and that's not the first time Ukraine invests massively in infrastructure, except that in the previous times, nothing has been built, almost nothing has been built. Here, you really have infrastructure being built. There's, of course, the questions about what's the market price for that infrastructure and whether there are rents on the way, and probably there are some, but people can see what's being built. Now, what I think is fundamental to this story, I think what we don't understand is that if we're in point A and we want to get to point B. Point B is a proper state, strong institutions, no corruption, market economy, no monopolies, separation and checks and balances of power, all kinds of things like that. That is not gonna be instant. It cannot be achieved instantly. I think people have an expectation that we can fix the banking system in a year or two, but it's going to be decades. Even though we have had major changes in 2 or 3 years in 2015, 2016, 17, but I think it's still a long process. So what I have found useful, so there's going to be a second insight that I would like to share. The first insight was that, I think looking at the issues from cultural perspective and from deeply held assumptions about what works, what doesn't, might be useful. So if a person believes that the only way to move forward in a career is by trading favors and needing cash to pay additional salaries to people, and that's what the person has learned throughout the career, Doesn't matter whether this person is young or elderly, how long he has been. But if this is what they learn works, it's very difficult to stop that. We can prosecute it all at once, but it will just be pushing towards corruption. You know, if the salaries are $500 or $200, the people have to be paid additionally or have to be given rents. And this is what they learn. If you find a way for yourself to get this rent, you'll be okay. You don't find yourself, you know, no one is going to take care of that. You volunteer for a couple of years, then your family hates you, and then you quit to business. So, you know, this is a very stable system. And they learn that one thing works, the other one doesn't. Now, in terms of reforms, what works? So my second insight would be that one should start small and from the very, very kind of easy target. So here's an example. Let's compare a banking reform, which was done by Hontareva in 2015 with anti-corruption reform again, which was done by Sitnik, head of NABU, National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine. So what Hontareva did, she would take a corrupt or, you know, bank controlled by vested interest, a small bank, and would clean it up, take it off the market, would get a lot of heat for this politically, but would take very small, relatively weak, politically weak bank, clean it up. That helps her build a little bit of experience and a little bit of credibility. Then she moves to the next one. And then she moves to the next one. And only eventually she took on Privatbank as the largest bank controlled by one of the biggest oligarchs in Ukraine. It was her last bank that she was working on. Had she tried to do it, had she tried to go for that bank as the first project, she would probably be out of the system or she would be stalled. So she started small, she built coalition, she got experience, she expanded her credibility or acquired credibility, okay? All right. Now let's look at Sitnik, who was in charge of NABU. What he was doing is every time there was a case, he had to investigate it. So he tried to prosecute all cases which violated, you know, according to the law. So essentially he went, you know, really, he went after everyone. And so very quickly he lost political support, and he has been able to prosecute some people, but, you know, it's not a story of Hontareva, who has been able to fundamentally change the banking system. And I can give other examples, such as success of Prozoro and failure of energy reform. In energy markets, we try to change all the markets at the same time, really deregulated, whereas Prozoro went, you know, starting with very small area scope of state procurement, making it electronic, accountable, and then expanding the scope as they acquired credibility and showed results and got public support. With the energy reform, we just wanted to do everything at the same time, and the public doesn't understand. There's no credibility, there's no leader, and so things like that, you know, do not work. Then the medical reform is somewhere in between. It is this reform was successfully done by the reformers, and it was successfully destroyed by the reformers. So that's one exception in my view. But I think that my second insight is that those people who have been very careful and very clear about their priorities, focus on small things, build their credibility, build reputation in the public space, and didn't try to go after everyone who, quote unquote, deserved it, but were very pragmatic about who they can take on and who they cannot. Those people with that approach have been much more successful. People who try to do everything right at the same time, those people failed, because it's not so much an economic issue, it's not so much an institutional issue. It's really a cultural issue and a political issue. So it's a fight, and you have to be and you're a low resource player there. So you have to acquire this resource. And so it takes time. So you can't fight all the battles at once. you will lose the war. And so in most cases where we see the war has been lost, it's because people have taken on a little bit too much responsibility. So that's my second argument, that you have to start small and build up.
Right, so some strategic sequencing. Also an undertone in what you said is that, and perhaps you've thought about it as someone who would like to spearhead change, is that the agents of change pay dearly, personally. And there is sort of a personal liability for making change happen. Kontareва is one example. So what happened was the medical reform team and the team she brought to the National Bank of Ukraine. The medical reform team is potentially another example. So there is reformers who take this on need to think that to them personally, that would be something that would lead to disutility. So these people need to be motivated by something. What are they motivated by? What are you motivated by? Why are you doing
So there are, I'm going to be answering this questions in terms of one point, I think we need to think about sustainability of any reformer. And the second part the second aspect I want to mention is about competence, what kind of skills you needed. But I was going to talk about this, but the question you asked is really about sustainability, because you're asking what feeds you, what drives you, what motivates you. And so let me answer that, and maybe then you either can ask me or I will say, because there are some issues about the skills mismatch. And then there is an issue of polarization because of that. Okay, so going to motivation. There are two separate stages. One stage is enthusiasm. This is when you enter, usually the state has a problem with human capital. So we're always looking for people who look good, who are well-trained, who are competent. They are not necessarily willing to let these people run the show. And that's where, that's the second part I want to talk about, the skill set. How to be effective in this system if you were trained outside of the system. But let's say that's taken care of. Your first, reaction in the beginning, you can do a lot of things, and after a while you burn out. So there are two stages to your motivation. One is when you start, and the second one when you go on. And that's why going on, it's really about sustainability. So starting, usually we have an inflow of people, let's say around a wave, we get a wave when there is a revolution or there is a change in, a presidential election. People sense that there is a window of opportunity. Indeed, a new team comes in the office, new challenges appear, and a lot of people can enter. A lot of people get, they get kind of,
they get high.
Romantic, they get romantic about it.
They get high, they get high on it.
Right, and so they want to go in, they want to change the country, everyone wants to change the country for the better, and that's a good motivation, but it's too general to be useful. And often it sets your expectation bars a little bit too high. And, it kind of, it's a harder fall then. I think I'm one of the not so many ones who survived and who served under different presidents. And, I have my share of public smearing, campaigns, and I've paid a high price in terms of, personal relationships, public profile, scrutiny, harassment, name calling.
Being hit in the face, I would say being hit in the face is one of them.
Yeah, that's another example. And, being called names, being investigated, persecuted, all kinds of things. That happens to everyone. maybe not physical, but it happened to me physically. So anyway, and for no reason really. But it's politics. It's a drama. Look at this from the drama perspective. Okay, so going back to how you need to have a system of support. And look at people who did great reforms like Kontareva, and she had her house in Ukraine burned and she's in exile. Look at Suprun, again, I have my views on that type of reform. I think they were too aggressive and that's why they were not successful. But anyway, Suprun is not in this. And yet there are other people like, let's say, Ivars, who have been, at times outspoken, but very effective and have done a lot of, good things and transformation and stayed on good terms. And, he has family, he has business, he is very successful. So I knew something like that would be needed. So I built an institution for myself, or was working with this institution. That was Kyiv School of Economics for me. For some people, it was business. For others people, it was something else. But people who just gave up everything and went without, into the government without thinking about plan B, plan C, and so on. I'm still holding the US position educationally. It's really high cost. It limits me in terms of what I can do. I cannot fully commit, let's say, to the government. But it helps me to be, the bottom line is you want to be paid well, and you want to be paid well outside of the government. I think that's what most people, when we talk about salaries, just accept it. Salaries inside the government will not be high for the next decades. If you don't
need
want
an
to
exit strategy,
corrupt,
right? You need an exit strategy. When you go in, you need to have an exit strategy.
Yeah, it's even more than that. You have to have a strategy throughout this. Not only exit, because if you go in, you actually have to stay around if you want your reforms or to have a longer term impact. So what you need to do, you have to have a scaffolding or ecosystem or infrastructure around you of friends, of profession, of your public reputation and stand that help you survive it in many ways unscathed. So that means either an NGO with which you are working and taking a longer term perspective. So fundamentally, you have to have an organization around you. It could be political, it could be educational, it could be business, but you have to have an organization. Don't go there if you don't have an organization outside of the government, if you want to stay. Otherwise, you have to enter and play by those rules. Accept it, that's fine. You don't have an organization, your organization will be the government or the political party. So play by those rules. If you don't like the rules, have your own organization. It's important, make yourself clear to the system, make yourself clear to other people so that people are not threatened by you. They understand you. That those deep cultural assumptions, they have to, don't conflict with your existence. If you're inside there of the system and people are used to one type of behavior and they can't understand you, and you're not showing, listen, I'm from a different organization. I play according to those rules. I'm a professor from the US. I still have my salary, It doesn't matter. I'll do what I can, but it's not a big deal. I'm not trying to become a prime minister. I'm not trying to run a faction in the parliament. I'm trying to do a land market reform. I'm an economist. I've been trained to create markets. That's the best which can happen in my life. I created the market. So I'm done. And I'm interested not in the market, not in becoming a minister for another term. So that makes you non-threatening to people who live according to different rules, and that's okay. You can operate with it. So I think the insight here is go inside the government, having an organization and having a long-term mission for that organization. Either you're or for the society overall. Don't go there because you just want to change something and you want to be in a position. That's very naive and in some sense dishonest. Well, so that's my third insight. I say, go have an organization which will support you when you go in.
In some way, that should make you to clever people who really want to run their sort of schemes on a large scale. You should be more threatening because that makes you more independent.
Yeah, but you protect yourself by explaining what the lines and committing to that. And without an organization, so what organization helps you to do is first, by seeing that there are other people like you in this organization, people understand that you are one of those. You're not a stranger. There are other people like you. There are other professors. There are other people with PhD from the West who do economic reforms in Ukraine. Most of them are in the Kyiv School of Economics. Okay, so everyone understands there is a cluster of people like that, and he's one of them. That's one thing. The second one is, yes, I'm more independent, but if I'm truly committed to my institution, to my organization, I have something to lose. What is it to lose? Well, the KEC, the Kyiv School of Economics. I don't want to fight the government. The Minister of Education and Science is my regulator. And I behave professionally as an institution. So therefore, I'm not threatening. I'm not trying to run a faction or leak the information. My longer term, in terms of game theory, my longer term net present value of continuing to develop KEC is higher than my value of betraying someone in the current political cycle. So organization helps, it doesn't only give me a mentorship and coaching and support mechanism, it also gives me a commitment mechanism where I can, agree to the rules and not break them, and it will be credible. So that makes you more effective.
So you're a reformer, but not a revolutionary. You're not being perceived as someone that's just going to come in, that's going to wreck things for your own benefit or whatever.
Exactly. So I'm not myopic. I think that's one. I can be a revolutionary, and I can be a part of an organization which is a revolutionary. Then it would look more political. Because I'm in education, I'm not a revolutionary. Because my students might be revolutionary, but that's different. I'm a president. I'm a rector of the school, so I'm not a revolutionary because I have something to protect. I'm thinking in terms of decades or maybe sometimes even centuries. I want to think. So KEC has been there for 30 years, trained most of macroeconomists. I think it is critical, much more important than my career. I've been a minister by now. Whatever I do is not so important. What's important is that I don't destroy the school which produces most of the macroeconomists in the country.
Well, not just macroeconomists, you produce all sorts of people, right? I mean,
now it's all it's procurement professionals to business school. We're doing all kinds of things, but I want to produce that. You could be a revolutionary, that's fine. Just be clear about this. I think that what the system wants, what people want, what opponents want, and they respect it if you're clear. You say, okay, I'm a revolutionary. If you assign me there, if you appoint me there, this is what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna break, and there is use for everyone. There are areas, Ontario was clearly a revolutionary. And she was supported by Poroshenko because there was a space, political space for Poroshenko to clean up the market. I'm pretty sure if we find a revolutionary in the energy market right now in Ukraine for political economy reasons, there would be a person like that cleaning up that market. So you can be a revolutionary, but just make sure that there is a scaffolding around you to support you.
And also understand that, revolutions tend to devour their,
everyone should understand. Again, be honest to yourself and don't be naive, okay? This is a marathon, it's not a sprint.
Speaking of myopic, sometimes from the outside, it looks from time to time, at least to me, and I spend time looking at it, that some of the actions or some of the proposals or some of the news that's coming out of the administration or the parliament, both, the way it sort of appears, that they have a significant degree of randomness, that like these things just sort of pop up. It seems like a random number generator. It's like, these things, let's rename the country, or let's do this, or let's do something else, or let's establish a free economic zone, or let's do something like, it looks like a collection of sort of random or pseudo-random sort of actions. My presumption is that there is an engine behind it, and so the appearance when they appear, it may seem random, or they may be truly random. They may be random in a sense of Brownian motion, in a sense that it's a degree of sort of political horse trading, if you will, and sometimes there is a degree of agreement that's achieved and something pops up. So it looks like Brownian motion because there are sort of larger forces in place, or it may be just completely random. What does it look like to you?
Yeah, so I wanted to answer on these competences that are needed in the second part of reformers being successful. And then let's go into this, into randomness. So, you know, if your culture, and it is related in some sense. So imagine you're operating in the environment, which is essentially top down, a very toxic environment because of political polarization, very verticalish, very strong, very directive, and that's the government.
And very focused on the immediate things that need to be done now, because there are always things coming up.
Yeah. So
very
but that's
short-term oriented.
So once you're in, you know, I've worked at the KC essentially as a crisis manager for the first 2 years, 2016, 2017. I had to remove 94% of admin staff personnel at KC. You know, this is really immediate. It was the question of survival. So Ukraine often in the state like that, and Russia is helping us to feel, you know, helps us to feel that way sometimes, or oligarchs help us feel that way, the state overall. So that's understandable. But again, you can have a very, you know, you can have an environment in which top down, or you can have an environment which is more flat, even if you're a crisis manager. And so so here's the cultural conflict. The entire society in Ukraine is very, very democratic. It's you know, it's about freedom. It's it's flat. The society is flat. There's no respect for authority. That's why we're having revolutions, by the way. It's a very flat. But the government, because we're in war and we're in constant crisis, operates as a vertical machine. It's almost a military. Okay, so that's a culture clash. And when you have a person who has succeeded on the outside, has been a professional banker or professional IT person, you know, like a commercial, some kind of commercial industry where it was competitive and it's, you know, merit based. And so that person is used to a very different approach of how things work. And he has learned that, let's say, you know, delegating and trusting and forgiving, this is operational, you know, you have to be polite, non-toxic. And then if you work in the government, just the opposite, you know, you can be perceived as weak if you are delegating or you're, you know, not harsh, you're not punishing for things. I learned it in hard way, but I kind of, you know, quickly learned it. And that's why I have been able to pass through the land market reform. But I really had to behave very, very differently from how I behave outside of the government. If I behave outside of the government the way I behave inside the government, you know, I would have been fired by the board of the Kyiv School of Economics. So what you end up with, you have a lot of great people who come into the government and they're absolutely unfit because they have learned to be successful in a very different mode of operations. And so then there is frustration and interpretation of, you know, how things are bad and something. So they're not bad, they're not good, they are what it is, you know, they are what they are. Okay, so that's I think what kind of skills you need. You know, it would help you to serve in the military. And, you know, a person who should be who can be successful in the government in an environment like that when there is a war, essentially have to have two sets of skills if he wants to be a reformer. Has to be able to operate under strict, you know, line of command and be very specific, very project oriented. And at the same time, it has to be a person from the kind of, you know, who is a visionary, who can think about concepts and and is able to prioritize and think of a long term. And there are very few because people tend to be successful either at one or the other one. And that's why, you know, you have waves of reformers come in and, you know, these are the times when the system is not very effective, they are needed there. And then as the system stabilizes, the economy stabilizes, the kind of, it comes back to the more disciplined approach. These guys fail, you know, because they just can't tolerate this kind of management style. And so they quit. And so we have this back and forth after every revolution or change of government. And, you know, we also demonize each other, you know. People who are reformers call themselves reformers, you know, as if they are the only ones who are changing things. And then people who are, you know, more of a stable, you know, more classic, most of the ranks, they call the reformers, other words, that these are people basically who have no idea how things are really working. And they call each other names. Reformers call those guys corrupt, and those guys call reformers bullshitters or populists, and it's non-productive. So you have to respect both cultures, and you have to understand that at different times, different cultures are more effective, and it would be better to remove that polarization. Now, going back to randomness, this is also a consequence of an attempt to capture the state. So this very authoritarian, this is very directive, these tendencies of the state. I'm not talking about individuals, I'm talking about bureaucrats. Kind of to be in the zone where you control everything. Every bureaucrat wants to have everything under control. This tendency is coming from the fact that if they don't control it, then someone from the business or political elites control it. So essentially, there's a constant threat of capture of state or any process, state process. And if you have this constant threat of capture, you can respond in two different ways. One way is essentially we have seen three ways of responding from three different presidents recently. Yanukovych responding by strengthening the top-down, suppressing any kind of alternative thinking. That didn't work out very well for him. It really was moving the state towards a dictatorship, and that conflicts with the nature of Ukrainian people. And I'm not making judgments here. I really came in the politics because of Yanukovych. It shouldn't be. I'm really against. I'm as anti-Yanukovych as it's possible. I don't want to get emotional about this. I'm trying to hold back and not make any judgment, statements. Okay, this is the person who I think is guilty of my citizens being murdered. Okay, so that's what, that's his fault. But anyway, I'm not, so he really tried to build a system of, a military throughout the state. And that didn't work.
And as a result, lots of people died.
Yeah, as a result. So then Poroshenko came in, and Poroshenko tried to solve this problem by micromanaging it. And that also doesn't work because you have a bottleneck, and
and as a result, some things got done, but many things didn't get done.
Yeah, and some things got discredited, which is in the longer run is a bad thing. Some of the liberalization reforms, especially on tariffs, and some of the pension reforms, and some of the medical reforms, they got discredited among the general public, and at the cost, it will be 10, 20 years of cost. We won't be able to run those things because the people have learned that this is not working, and some of these reforms got bad name, bad reputation. So it really imposes restrictions on, it's not good either. And then I think what currently is trying to, they are not the current administration. I have, since I'm working for them, I'm not going to go in details, and I can't, but I think the approach is different, and that appeals to me in some ways. But the approach is trying to keep, it's kind of, I would call it political agile approach. They keep changing directions a little bit because that protects them from being captured. So if you're very, very dynamic, it's very difficult to foresee you. It's very difficult to predict you, and really helps with respect to Russia and with respect to oligarchs. Okay, so that aspect. And the second aspect is that we need to think, I'm inside, and it has been difficult for me to understand at times to understand the policies or the logic until I started to look at it from the political perspective, from the drama, from this, sort of how you design this scenario that you don't get captured, that, people who are against you, oligarchs, let's say, or Russia, Medvedchuk, for example, they're perceived by the public as a villain, as an enemy, as a, bad anti-hero. So, and how you keep that way, that this guy suddenly don't get public support. And so if you start looking at things from that perspective rather than from an institutional perspective, then things start making sense. So I think it's an angle. It's an angle of perspective. Definitely the policies are not random in my view.
Super interesting, which brings us to a very interesting development, sort of new development, I would think was this administration about using the very particular tool to implement policies, which sort of hasn't been used as much in the past, which is the RNBO. And
National Security Council, yeah.
Right, and that to me, that would sort of characterize this administration as sort of being different from others. That is, it has been utilizing this particular tool with quite significantly, I would say, and that is sort of, at least to me, that looks different from sort of micromanagement or from sort of dictatorial approach, because it is a collective body, first of all. So it's not a sort of dictatorial outright, right? And it's also it's not micromanaging in the sense that it is quite strategic. I mean, it is a body that really it sets strategies, but it doesn't really have implementation power, if you will. It does, but it's more of a strategy setting, and it cuts through a lot of things. What's prompted that? How did that come about? Can you talk a bit about why this particular mechanism, and because it has been effective?
So I think we should ask the question why it has been effective. And I can talk from experience again.
Please.
There have been a couple of cases where we wanted to take over. I mean, take control or re-establish control of a state-owned enterprise. The company which supposedly is controlled by the government, but in practice it is controlled by an oligarch. So the management is more afraid of an oligarch than of the government and law enforcement. And when you try to fire this management and change this management, what happens usually when you do it in the usual way, let's say you call a cabinet, or you have a cabinet meeting, or a minister who is, the minister has the right to appoint the CEO of this. Sometimes if this is a big company, you need to have a supervisory board. But let's look at the case first without a supervisory board. So you have a CEO, and the minister can directly appoint or remove this guy. Imagine the government wants to remove this guy. By the time the government comes with a resolution, delivers it physically to the enterprise, usually at that time there's already a court decision blocking or disputing or challenging the decision of the government. I've had cases like that. I changed 150 CEOs of state-owned companies, and 3 or 5 of them really resisted me and challenged that in court. And in the end, there are a couple of guys I couldn't really get rid of them. And it was I knew for a fact that they were. I knew, I had all kinds of law enforcement reports that these guys were corrupt, and I wanted to get rid of them. I couldn't, because by the time I would get, in 2 hours that I would get, that the document would be somewhere between my signature and delivering it would be leaked. There would be a campaign. There would be a court decision. There would be resistance. Sometimes there would be thugs. Which at times we wouldn't be able even, we wouldn't be able to enter the enterprise, the company, the plant. Now, National Security Council bypasses this because it's really, it's classified. Well, it's not classified in there are different degrees of classification, but because it's national security, people are persecuted for leaking information, fewer people are involved, and you have been, so there are big companies in which we have been able to change the leadership of the companies because when it was done through the National Security Council, as opposed to when it was done through the Cabinet of Ministers. So that I think it's a very pragmatic kind of positive description, positive in the sense of good, but as is description of what's happening. It's happening again because of that issue of the constant threat of capture. That becomes almost everything, any dispute over major assets or any policy which is threatening interests, either oligarchic interests or Russian interests, the interests which can capture the government or trying to capture the government becomes a national security issue, and it has to be treated as a national security with some elements of secrecy. And you have all the trade-offs you have between the kind of information aggregation and quality of decisions and national security considerations, secrecy and effectiveness. So we shouldn't forget that we are in war, and that imposes constraints, and that's your national security trade-off.
We're coming up to the hour, so I'd like to perhaps wrap this up with a question to you. We could obviously talk about it for hours. This is just getting started. About what do you sort of feel as what are the biggest challenges from your perspective for Ukraine going forward? So from what you see, sort of 5 biggest challenges for the next year, 2, 5 that you would foresee. There are obvious ones related to energy. There are obvious ones related to geopolitics. There are obvious ones related to sort of how things are shaping up in the political cycle. Anything over and above?
So the classic 5s are this, Russian geopolitics, energy, political cycle, pandemics, and macroeconomic stability, given the changes that the IMF and everything. So that's your classic 5s. You're going to put, so you basically, well, when we talk about geopolitics, we can say national security, defense, military, all of that cluster. Again, energy, IMF, World Bank, structural reform, political cycle. And with that political cycle, a little bit intervened, we have the judicial reform, and then, courts, that's really there. And then we have pandemic. So this is your classic 5s. Non-classic 5s, so something else I would think about it, we should focus on anti-monopoly or on competition authority. Because what has been done is that we have cleaned up the finance sector, financial sector, and we have seen that it has performed quite well over the course of the pandemics. But the real sector is in which we need a strong regulator. And we don't have a strong regulator. If we get a central bank type regulator for the real sector, and we can stop or prevent or limit the abuses by companies, I think we will be playing on a different field.
Is there a movement in that direction? Is the anti-oligarch law are steps in that direction?
Yeah, you need to limit a little bit, the pressure on the institutions to be able, it's like wrestling, if you're being squeezed, you have very little room to get things through. So let's see. I think at least politically, it makes a lot of sense to have this anti-oligarch. It's a rhetoric, it's a perception, it's the people. So I think answering your second question, I mentioned how much we have gone forward, how much progress Ukraine has done. If we take a longer run perspective. I was on the supervisory board of the National Bank of Ukraine in 2016 when the
connection is glitching a bit.
Was nationalized. Can you hear me okay? Because my connection I think is bad.
You're a little bit frozen, so when you come back up, I'll tell you when you're back up. Currently, you're frozen. front. So I'm going
to try to make different.
Compose. I think you're back up. We can see you on your phone now. I cannot hear quite you yet. You are on mute on your phone.
All right, so I'm back. I used the phone to connect because I have difficulty with Wi-Fi. Okay.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you.
All right, so I think what I wanted to say is that just to judge the progress in 2016, when I served as the deputy chairman of the National Bank of Ukraine Supervisory Board, when the National Bank decided to privatize, to nationalize, revoke the license of Privatbank, and it was owned by Kolomoisky. I remember I was afraid to speak public, even to name Kolomoisky. And the first time we started, most of our experts, started writing about it publicly without fear, or with some fear, was the fall of the winter of 2016-2017, when the bank was nationalized. Now, when I was entering the position of the minister, again, Kolomoisky was accused me of something and called me names, and I was afraid to respond to him aggressively, And so, but now it's impossible, No one would, the oligarchs, this specific one or others, have much less. Everyone is talking about them. In 3 or 4 years, we moved when the country was afraid physically of people who were trying and have been successful in many ways to capture elements of the state, to having this discussions left and right everywhere in public. So it's a very different world, and so there is some process going on, and I think that's an example where things are changing.
To me also, maybe it's just my subjective feeling. To me, it just sort of feels like their time is coming to an end. I mean, first of all, these are old men, and the way they run things is kind of like, it's not cool. I mean, it's just like universally accepted as not cool. And, it's just going to be a matter of time. They won't go without a fight, obviously, and they'll keep some things. But I think I'm sort of sharing your perception that it's a matter of, this oligarchic era will come to an end. The critical part is, what do you have to offer in return? What is being offered that, once these people are no longer running these massive conglomerates, what's being offered? Are people still going to have jobs? Are people still going to have access to, are still taxes going to be collected at the level that they're going to be collected? Because their companies pay taxes. Their companies employ people. Their companies, propose a particular way of progression. What is being offered in return? Their era will end. What's a new era?
So I think this is the second non-obvious but important reform or change that's needed. It's capital markets. We need to relax the constraints. The constraints are the survival of everyone, including oligarchs. Oligarchs are trying to survive. So they will be fighting because they are cornered. What is needed is for them to have an ability to become, people who operate not in real sector and make decisions, and try to lobby the governments, but basically, have funds, have foundations, and they, more or less can keep, there will be court decisions. There is an issue of justice. There is a back pay, backdate taxes, and all kinds of things. But fundamentally, after that, their property rights should be protected. If we want them not to fight, or we want them to fight, and we can decide with which ones we're going to fight, with which, it has to be strategically decided by society or by the governments or some leadership. And for that, we really need the capital market. The capital market will do three things. That's one of the things. It will give an exit to some of the oligarchs or to some of the old money. And then through the capital markets, you can rechannel it into the new economy or new people. Let the new people manage it, okay? The second one, you need to do something about the pension reform. You really have to see people that, to have people some certainty in the future. And for that, the government, as long as it's going to be, kind of sitting in this solidarity system where it's offering a share of taxes, it's unclear what's happening. There's no political feedback. And the third one is there's going to be check on populism. If we have capital markets which respond quickly to populist decisions which hurt economy, then politicians will be disciplined. So I think the major reform structure which is needed in Ukraine, it's fundamental. It's capital markets. That has to start working. That is the indirect way to address a lot of issues, from oligarchs to even energy, to pension reform, to constraint check on populism.
I think in some way the sort of the sequencing of the oligarch is becoming clear, and that is, the obviously pro-Russian national security threatening oligarchs should go. I mean, there's no place for them. Their property rights should not be protected. I mean, what's the point of protecting property rights of the people, of the empires that are going to, they're supporting the people who are killing your citizens. The second one is probably, and it will probably come very, very close to the forefront, is the energy market. People will see just what's lack of a competition in some way is doing in the energy market. And then there's probably going to be everybody else. On the latter stages, it's sort of less clear, but the first two are sort of a little bit obvious. Maybe I'm wrong.
Yep, I agree with you. I think there is a question about legalization of corruption, I think somewhere in
I
Q&A.
think there's a question sort of a bit about lobbying. My understanding is like pretty much everybody lobbies in Ukraine. So it's not like you need to legalize it. I mean,
No, but it would help legalize it in a sense that
help legalize it.
It would help because it would make it more transparent, and people can declare how they're spending money. You have to kind of acknowledge it. Yeah, everyone lobbies. It's okay. Everyone is doing it, but it's not transparent. So that there is a lot of inefficiency, because when we see a person, we don't know who that person represents, and so on and so forth.
And of course, the more resources you have, the more access you can potentially gain.
Absolutely,
right?
absolutely. So that has to be kind of legalized or at least formalized.
Okay, so
I want to
question.
maybe read the rest of that question, which was by Anton Deck. So it was about lobbying, but also, do you think that Ukraine should legalize certain amounts, certain forms of corruption, or something that is perceived as corruption?
So, let's become specific, because this sort of, it's not an ideological question. If a person gives a bribe to a doctor in a public hospital, some part of this bribe is really for, paying the market salary of the doctor, or paying for some, even sometimes for supplies that they might not have. So the state has improved quite a bit financial support of doctors and salaries, so that's going to help. But in principle, I think you want to allow these payments being formal. You might even want to tax them. And, Second, let's take schools, public schools. Majority of almost everyone in Ukraine studies in public schools. You pay every week or every month a certain amount for supplies. You pay to the right now it's semi formalized or semi-legalized. You make contributions to the charitable foundations of the school, and the school pays salaries, additional salaries. So there we also want to deregulate it, that there's more transparency and more competition, because otherwise, you want to make these contributions either unconditional, so you're paying rather than every time you get faculty or administration solicit payments. So that's, we're talking about small petty corruption, right? When we are talking about corruption in the sense of the classic sense of corruption, diversion of public funds for private use, that means stealing from the state. I think we don't want to legalize it, but we want to increase salaries, and we want to talk about it, and we want to say that people have to be paid according to the, but it's a really difficult issue.
Okay. Then there is a second question from the audience from Peter Benchuk. I'm sorry if I mispronounced some names. So are Ukrainian oligarchs real, and do they exert undue political influence?
Say it again. I didn't hear. Are
Ukrainian oligarchs real, and do they exert undue political influence?
Well, it depends on the definition undue. And it depends on who we call, what I've learned is every business exerts political influence. And in many ways it's undue, because they're not lobbying in the committees of the parliament, but they're lobbying or, offering deals to individual MPs, and then those MPs or some regulators or civil servants, they represent things as their own personal opinion in meetings, and that shape the policy. It's just that the oligarchs, the bigger companies, also have many more mechanisms, and they're kind of, conglomerates of this. They have TV stations, they have enough resources to have substantive influence over multiple members of parliaments and so on and so on. Have I been, I once was in a case, in a situation where I didn't appoint someone, and I was challenged by an oligarch, almost threatened, because the appointment didn't go the way that person wanted. So, there is pressure. But again, I think in those industries where there is, so in that specific case, it depends. You can get scared and, oh my God, this is oligarch. Or you can say, fine, you shouldn't be doing this. And okay, let's have, what's your interest? But there are other interests. And, in that case, I called the head of 2 committees. I had a number of deputy ministers, some ministers, and we kind of, I immediately created a coalition. And we kind of found a compromise, or a political compromise. We did not appoint that person, but we didn't appoint the other person. I restarted the competition and sort of de-escalated the issue, but I didn't succumb to the pressure. And, fundamentally, none of this pressure is real. I mean, you need to be a little bit tough in a sense that, as I have recently been physically attacked, you have to be tough. This is not a job for people who are lighthearted. But it's fundamentally, in my view, is not life-threatening. There are exceptions, but it's not. And it's not even, criminally or politically threatening. Yeah, the worst can be people will not like it. I did the land market reform. Okay, my reputation has been smeared by, publicly, so fine. I still people around me, my family, friends, love me and proud of me. So, if you can live with that, that's fine. So I think pressure is there, but it's a little bit, depends, you can resist it.
Okay, good. Well, now is the next question from Nicholas Aragon. What is really the problem with capital markets to work? Ban competition or anything else? How optimistic are you on the small land market reform for agricultural productivity?
Okay, so what is really the problem for capital markets to work? I think the property rights protection. So, if we want public companies to be tradable, then we want to get all the, shareholder rights protected and things like that. So that needs to be done, and there will be attempts to subdue. So it's a difficult reform. How optimistic are you on this small land market reform for agricultural productivity? I think it's actually good because, so now I changed my mind a little bit. I think if we had a really drastic, fast reform, the companies would get scared and would try to, kind of invest or divest resources from what they need, from equipment, from into buying land and securing it. So that didn't happen. So right now the agriculture sector is doing quite well, and they have a future to look to. They have some certainty about how this reform goes, and so this is probably helping the large and small companies to make better investment plans over the next 5-10 years. So I think it's a good reform, really. And the agricultural productivity grows every year. Let's hope it stays that way. At least I think so. Yeah.
Okay. And land market reform was mentioned a couple of times, but could you just briefly explain to our viewers who might not be familiar with it, what it was and how did it happen that Ukraine did not have a land market for almost 30 years?
I think we were one of the last countries in the world where we didn't have until 2021 the land market. What it means formally is that agricultural land, if you are an owner, you wouldn't be able to sell it freely. That's just prohibited. You would be able to rent it out for 49 years, but you wouldn't be able. So there were all kinds of gray schemes in kind of pseudo trading schemes with less legal protection, and the banks wouldn't take it as collateral, things like that, right? And who was benefiting from this? People who can bypass, who have capital or equity, who can bypass these regulations, and this helped the market, or they helped those large agricultural companies which accumulated massive holdings. So, and I think they were the main beneficiaries of keeping the status quo, just uneven playing field. But I don't know why it happened. I really burned a lot of all of my political energy and resource that I had on this reform. And I think I came in the office on the 29th of August, and within 2 weeks, on the 15th of September, we submitted to the not to the parliament, to the cabinet, the law on land market reform. And on the 27th of September, it was passed by the cabinet. And I remember this betting games with MPs and some of the business people and politicians were saying you wouldn't even be able to get it out of the cabinet to the parliament. And so in a month from appointment, we got it to the cabinet, from the cabinet to the parliament for voting, and then it got stuck there with 4,000 amendments, and it dragged and dragged and dragged. We were pushing and pushing, and eventually I think this summer it finally started. So I think I'm an accomplished economist in that sense. I regret nothing except the mental pressure that I received for that.
Well, you cannot get rid of that entirely in Ukrainian politics, I guess, unfortunately. Then there is a question from Yevhen Lyubchenko. What are the barriers to the creation of a capital market in Ukraine?
What are the barriers?
I think you answered that already. Property rights, corporate governance.
Yeah, I think competence of people, overall understanding of kind of education. Yeah, more or less. Yeah.
Education.
Let me explain what I mean by that. So in macroeconomic, it's in macroeconomic area in Ukraine, it's almost impossible to manipulate the public perception. Why? Because at least a third of economic journalists of the country have been trained at the Kyiv School of Economics or somewhere else where at least third has been. Half of the economic journalists of Forbes Ukraine are graduates of with proper master program in Ukraine, but by Western PhDs, and we are focusing on macro. So when let's make it more specific. In Ukraine, several companies, including Bloomberg, but also some investment banks, run surveys among experts and among journalists about what would be the next, what would be the interest rate decision of the central bank. And they get it right. And if there is a deviation, there is a competent professional discussion whether it was a result of political pressure or something else. So it disciplines, it protects the central bank in so many ways, because everyone understands it. If the central bank makes a random or strange move, everyone will know it. By the end of the day, when they make this move, the news cycle will be all over it. That there has been pressure on the central bank. You cannot do anything like that on the on the value of the company. There's no one. You can't run a survey on a major company. What's their value? No one has any clue. No one has been trained on this. There are no journalists who are have understand enough of the context and have been in the field for long enough that then in the 15 minutes they can write a proper blog or an article on the issue if something happens. So because they don't do it, the professional PR companies do it, sponsored by those who stand to benefit from these moves. So essentially, because we don't have a scaffolding again of journalists of the who are well competent enough, and the readers and experts, the markets can be, the public perception can be manipulated. So that's what I mean by education, professional education in the field.
Interesting. So the analyst, right? So my comment to that would be like Ukrainians are very, very smart people. I mean, look at the IT sector, right? I mean, if people could write code at this level, and they trade, cryptocurrencies, probably, second or third,
top four, I think,
fourth or something, in the top five, people are clever. They know about these things. So, but I think you're correct on what you said, and that there is an infrastructure of analysts who follow companies. There is an infrastructure of sort of experts who reveal information about the management of companies and help public make decisions. And that one, I would agree, that one is lacking. That one is lacking. So that's probably fair to say.
Okay. Thank you. Then there's another question from Vika Shifodel. I'm sorry if I mispronounced the last name. Would you agree that lobbying, so this is again about lobbying, would you agree that lobbying is synonymous to legal corruption? If so, how would you reconcile this legalization with the fight against corruption?
I don't understand the question, so let me try to rephrase it in the way I understand. So to me, corruption is, people call corruption everything. And if you ask people what's really the definition of corruption is, it's very difficult to pinpoint. They say, oh, this minister steals money, or this head of the department made this decision, he's corrupt. And, they can do much more damage when they're incompetent than when they get $10,000 for making a decision. It's not even clear when we call them or someone calls them corrupt, that they're taking money rather than being bribed, rather than following political interest and things like that. So we cannot call everything corruption. There is a definition of corruption. Diverting public funds for private gain. So, I'm basically saying, guys, there's this public fund, there's a budget program, I'm going to send it your way and you give me something, you give me a kickback. That should never be legalized. So if we take the narrow definition of corruption, absolutely not. If we take a broader definition of corruption, where we're talking about influence and non-transparency of that, then we want to formalize it and make it legal. That, I'm meeting with someone, but I have to report it, or the companies which are trying to, provide some support, political support to me in the parliament, then they have to report it. They can do it, but they have to report it.
Side payments, political contributions, all of that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, providing resources, let's be, kind of helping me to travel around, as a member of parliament or someone like that, So all kinds of things like that, they are happening. And if people, they are prohibited often. But, I think we're better off. So again, this is the same argument. You can't fight all types of corruption at once. That's why we are not making much progress. We have to pick up those which are critical and understand what the core reason of those is, what the core, and then to try to change the rules of the game or maybe culture, so the new generations of people who enter the government and politics don't learn that. But if you can't fight against the current, if you're paying salaries of 30,000 hryvnias, which is $1,000, to people where in the positions where you need people whose market value is 10 times more, what are you doing?
And just recently, you were appointed to this supervisory board of Ukroburonprom, right, the state-owned conglomerate of companies that focus on defense manufacturing. So, and this is the company that is rather famous for all those critical corruption cases. So, what do you intend to do to prevent this from happening?
I would say
well, my job there is
you're the chairman, right?
No, I'm not the chairman of the board. I'm chairman of the supervisory board. That's correct. But I'm the chairman of supervisory board. There's a chairman of the board. We have two board systems in Ukraine, executive boards and supervisory board. So basically there's a general director and I'm chairman of the supervisory board. So I think my job is to transform Ukroburonprom. And there is a law 3822, which has been passed about the corporatization of Ukroburonprom. And that's what I'm going to do. This is a structural reform which will create corporate governance, I hope, in majority of the companies at the Ukroburonprom. And in that way, it will be a systemic effort and change towards increasing the efficiency and eradicating corruption. But again, I think the issues are deeper than just corruption. If you look at the companies and that there are distortions there. Let's say, well, here's one structural issue. Where is corruption coming from? Corruption often is coming from international trade of weapons. Or it used to be coming from there. So second one is that, what kind of companies does the state need? The state needs the companies which produce for Ukrainian military. Okay, it's great to trade internationally, but that's not the objective. That's not the primary objective. The primary objective is to develop R&D capabilities which are needed for national security objectives and being able to deliver those. Now, these companies which have 90% of orders from the Ukrainian military, they're essentially not trading internationally. So the issue of corruption is not, the risk of corruption is minor there. Of course, they could be on procurement, but procurement is monitored, so, there are issues there, but they're not of the type. And so when we're saying the key is Ukroburonprom, it's all about corruption, let's fight this, we're really forgetting that we need to build capabilities. So we're focusing on the companies which are not immediately needed. So those could be companies which are great at repairing some Soviet Union equipment or something like that. And they have major procurement orders international, and there are all kinds of issues. But and then there are high precision companies which are struggling financially because of the old regulation on, cost pricing. And they don't have enough margin to be able to invest. And so they have to be cross-subsidized by those companies which are trading international. It's all perverse. So really, if you want to be true to yourself, and the job is to ensure that the Ukrainian military has capacity in Ukroburonprom, in this industrial complex, to develop the capabilities and fulfill needs that are needed for the sovereignty of Ukraine, you might have a very different priority list than it is publicly perceived. Again, a lot of these things are classified, but
But I think the major trade-offs, I think you've outlined very clearly. That's right. Very interesting. We are very interesting and very, very important insider perspective on a lot of issues. I think we're coming to a close. There's one last question that that perhaps I'd like to ask, dear to my heart, about crypto assets. If you have anything to say on that. There's a law. The law has been vetoed. The National Bank of Ukraine has.
I think that will be cleaned up. I think we need to move there. So again, I think the minister, Vice Prime Minister for Digital Transformation, he's doing fine, and he's, he has done a lot for for changing things, and he's developing the field, and he's very progressive, and I think we need it. So on that issue, I think these things will be just done. There are a little bit of a hiccup, political hiccup in terms of which agency is going to be regulating the market, so that's expected. But again, I think it's minor in my view.
Excellent. On that
thank you very much.
Should we bring it to a close, Andrei?
Yes, but thank you very much for your questions, Dr. Kirilenko, and thank you very much for your answers, Dr. Mylovanov. And I hope our audience enjoyed it at least as much as I have just watching you talk.
Thank you very much. It's an honor and privilege.
Thank you so very much, and goodbye, everybody.
Bye.
Yeah. Thank you, our audience, for watching. Goodbye.